She wore a crown at the heart of a Catholic empire. Then war tore that world apart. Hated by some, driven into exile, widowed at 29, and stripped of everything but her faith, Empress Zita refused to surrender what she believed had been entrusted to her by God. This is the story of the Catholic empress who lost her palace, her throne, her country, and still would not break. Long before Zita ever became empress, she had already tasted the pain of loss. Born in 1892 into a royal family that knew exactly what it meant to watch a throne disappear. Her father, Robert of Parma, had been the last reigning Duke of Parma before the upheavals of Italian unification swept that power away. Her mother came from the exiled Portuguese royal line. So even before Zita wore an imperial crown, she had grown up in a household that understood something most rulers prefer not to think about. Crowns can be taken, titles can be stripped away, and the world can turn very quickly against old thrones. By no means was Zita formed in shallow grandeur. She was raised in a deeply Catholic environment, shaped by discipline, prayer, and service. After her father's death, part of her education continued with religious women connected to Solzames, Benedictines who were themselves living in exile after anti-religious policies in France had driven them out. Even her schooling carried the same lesson her family history had already taught her. What is sacred in life does not become less sacred just because the age around it has grown hostile. Then she met Karl, not as some fairy tale prince stepping into a ballroom, but as a man who, like her, had been formed inside a Catholic home that took duty seriously. They married in 1911 after Zita had gone to Rome with her mother to receive the blessing of Pope Pius X. Zita and Carrie made a pledge to each other is still remembered today. The pledge reads in this manner: "Now we will help each other to go to heaven." That pledge is the key to the whole story. Because when disaster came, Zita did not experience marriage, power, and suffering the way the modern world would. She experienced them through a Catholic conscience. And disaster did come, not in a way that allowed anyone time to prepare. It came as war. In 1914, the assassination at Sarajevo ripped open a crisis that would consume Europe. For Zita and Karl, that moment changed everything. They had expected time. They had expected years before the weight of the throne might ever fall on them. Instead, the whole political structure around them lurched into emergency. War broke out in August. Karl entered military service as a general in the Austrian army. Zita settled with the children at Schönbrunn, but that did not mean she was hidden away in safety. She spent part of her days in hospitals in Vienna. She visited the wounded. Sometimes she went with Karl to the front, including the Romanian front, where the official life page says she spent hours with the wounded. So already, before she was empress, she was living inside blood, exhaustion, and grief. That is what is intriguing about her story. One would imagine a royal woman protected by silk curtains and court ceremony. But the reality presents something harder. She was close to the suffering. She saw what the war was doing to bodies, to families, to the empire itself. And at the same time, the war made her suspect. Because Italy entered the conflict against Austria-Hungary, some subjects refused to see Zita as their empress. They regarded her as an outsider. They called her the Italian. Her own brothers were on opposing sides of the war. The empire demanded loyalty from her, while the war itself split her own family. That is where the persecution pressure begins in this story. She was in real sense a woman carrying a Catholic duty in a political world that had grown vicious, suspicious, and unstable. She was serving the wounded while being distrusted by the people she was serving. She was trying to hold together a public role while the war was already turning every background, every allegiance, every family connection into a reason for accusation. Then in 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph died. Karl was proclaimed emperor. Zita became empress. And that moment, which should have looked like triumph, came already soaked in tragedy. The official life page describes their coronation in Budapest on December 30th, 1916, as the one brief moment of glory in the lives of the young couple. And even that glory quickly became surrendered to the will of God. The wedding page tied to her cause says the coronation ritual presented the crown not as vanity, but as a burden, and explicitly told the queen to care for the people of God with humility in Christ. That is how Zita understood the office she had received, not as a jewel, but as a charge. And that is why what came next struck so deep. Because if the crown is only an ornament, losing it is humiliation. But if the crown is a duty before God, losing it feels like watching a sacred trust be torn out of your hands. Karl tried to make peace. He was not trying to keep the war raging forever. It is said he pursued a separate peace with France and England through Zita's brothers, Sixtus and Xavier. It is also reported that Pope Benedict XV called the belligerents to peace, and that Karl was the only ruler to respond positively. Zita herself was involved in humanitarian efforts during that period, obtaining from the Germans a promise to spare civilians, the Belgian royal residence, and the Cathedral of Reims. So to reduce this couple to relics of a doomed empire is to miss the moral seriousness with which they were acting in the middle of collapse. But peace failed, and with that failure, the empire began to die before the eyes of everyone. Each part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy began declaring independence. The new German Republic of Austria demanded that the emperor be stripped of power. According to the official narrative on Zita's page, Karl never abdicated. The family moved to Eckartsau. Then their wandering life began. First Switzerland in 1919, then failed restoration attempts in Hungary in 1921, and finally exile farther away than before, to Funchal on the island of Madeira. This is where the title earns itself, because at this point, Zita is no longer a young empress in ceremony and silk. She is a Catholic sovereign watching the whole political and civilizational world she belongs to being dismantled around her. To many around her, monarchy had become an embarrassment, a relic, a political inconvenience. But to Zita, the crown was still tied to conscience, responsibility, and the duty to the people placed under it. That is why she refused, inwardly, to treat it as a costume that could be put on when useful and discarded when the winds changed. The world had already judged the old Catholic empire as finished. She did not suddenly decide that duty had become meaningless just because defeat had made it costly. Then came Madeira, and Madeira was not picturesque exile. It was abandonment. The official life page says they were abandoned by all, living in poverty and discomfort, with no financial means, even as Karl grew sick. Those are hard words, but they matter, because the phrase, palace to poverty, is not just an artistic phrase in this story. It is a literal descent. A crowned couple, cut off from power, from income, from security, and from the world that had once recognized them, now stranded far from the empire, trying to survive. That is the moment where the story stops being merely historical and becomes almost biblical in its severity. Because once the court is gone, once the power is gone, once the titles no longer protect you, what remains is the soul. And Zita's soul was about to be tested far more cruelly than before. Karl fell ill in Madeira. A cold became something worse. Then pneumonia. Then the deathbed. He died on April 1st, 1922 at the age of 34. The official life page says he died, completely abandoned to the will of God. Zita was left widowed with 7 living children beside her and an 8th still unborn, who would be born 2 months later. She was widowed at age 30. The broader tradition around the story often emphasizes just how young she still was. She was a young woman in exile, with children around her, no restored throne in sight, no secure future, and no husband. This is the core of the whole story. Not the coronation, not the ceremony, not the titles. This, the widow in exile, the mother with children, the empress with no empire, the Catholic woman left with duty and grief at the same time. She never remarried, and for the remaining 67 years of her life, she dressed in black in mourning for Karl. The official life page says she did so in a spirit of fidelity to her beloved husband. The British Historical Society of Portugal article gives the same detail very plainly. For the remaining 67 years of her life, Zita always dressed in black in mourning for him. That matters because it tells you this was not a passing theatrical gesture. It became the shape of her public witness. She had loved, lost, and chosen to remain faithful in the ruins. This is also where the sanctity thread becomes intelligible, not because she had once stood near a throne, but because after catastrophe she did not collapse into self-pity, bitterness, or luxury in exile. The spirituality page tied to her cause says that she and Karl lived an intense Eucharistic life, that daily participation in the Eucharist was the indispensable foundation of her prayer and charity, that she had great devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and that the Rosary was part of her life. The beatification page adds that several traits are under attention in her cause: her sense of service, her attention to others, her surrender to divine providence and courage, especially in exile, and the seriousness with which she raised her 8 children as Christians. That is the difference between a tragic royal biography and a Catholic witness. Although many people can suffer, not all sufferings become holy. What the Church is examining in Zita is not whether she suffered, but how she suffered. Whether loss made her smaller, harder, emptier, or whether, under the pressure of loss, her fidelity became clearer, and the pressure still was not over, because history had not finished driving her out. After Spain came Belgium. There, at least for a time, she tried to do what mothers do after disaster: stabilize the children, educate them, prepare them for the future. The official life page says she lived in Spain for 6 years, devoted to the education of her children, then moved near Brussels in 1929 so that the older ones could study at Louvain. Even in a few circumstances, she remained in contact with loyal subjects, hosting some of them in Belgium. Although the court was gone, the network of fidelity was not. Then Europe broke again. In 1938, Austria was annexed by the Nazi regime. The official life page says repression struck those who remained attached to the imperial family. In May 1940, after the German invasion of Belgium, Zita once again took the road of exile, across France, then Spain, then Portugal, before the family finally settled in Quebec. And the same source adds a brutal line: poverty was a daily reality throughout that period. So the woman who had once lived at the center of an empire spent the 20th century learning, over and over, how quickly history can strip a life down to uncertainty. And even then, she did not retreat into silence. The official life page says that after the war, she gave conferences in the United States and Canada to raise funds for war-ravaged Austria and Hungary. It is easy to pass over that detail, but it should not be, because it shows something essential about her. She no longer had a throne. She no longer commanded armies. She no longer presided over a court. Yet she still behaved like a woman responsible for a people. The office had been destroyed. The sense of duty had not. In 1953, she returned to Europe, eventually settling in Switzerland and spending long stays with the Benedictines of Solesmes, with whom she had spiritual ties going back decades. The official page notes that she had become an oblate in 1926. Then, in 1982, after 6 decades, she was finally allowed to return to Austria. She was 90 years old. By then, she was no longer simply a figure from dynastic history. She had become a living witness to a vanished Catholic world, and to the cost of staying faithful after that world had been shattered. Then came the final scene: the funeral. The Portugal article describes it in unforgettable detail. Zita died in 1989 after 70 years in exile. Vienna received her funeral. Thousands filled St. Stephen's Cathedral, and tens of thousands were outside. Then the old Habsburg ritual was enacted at the Capuchin Church. Her titles were proclaimed at the door: Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, and the long chain of dignities attached to the old monarchy. The monk inside answered that he did not know her. The titles were proclaimed again. Again he answered that he did not know her. Then, at the third knocking, she was named simply as Zita, a mortal, sinful person. Only then were the doors opened. That is where the story should end. Not with her in satin and diamonds. Not with the court at Budapest. Not with the vanished empire at all. But with a Catholic woman who had passed through war, suspicion, political hatred, exile, widowhood, poverty, Nazi displacement, and old age, and who in the end entered as every Christian must enter, stripped of titles, stripped of rank, stripped of the world's language of greatness, and received only as a sinner before God. That is why her cause exists. The formal investigation into her beatification was opened in 2009, and the association dedicated to her cause says the Church is examining her life as mother, wife, and sovereign, along with her service, courage, prayer, and surrender to divine providence. In other words, the question is no longer whether she once wore a crown. The question is what she did when everything that crown represented was taken away. That is Empress Zita, the Catholic empress who refused to surrender her crown. If you enjoyed this video, you will also appreciate the one that comes up at the end of this video. Foederis Arca catalogs and archives the stories of our beautiful Catholic faith. Kindly like, share, and subscribe to this channel. You can support this work through Buy Me a Coffee. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I give thee my heart and my soul. O Mary, co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces, pray for us.